Hello and welcome everyone to Painting for Parkinson's, celebrating 27 years of creative practice. My name is Philip Piggin, one of the Dance Parkinson's Australia co-directors, and I'm a dance practitioner based in Canberra, working with the ZEST Dance for Wellbeing program. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we are joining from today. I am joining you from Ngunnawal lands in southern New South Wales. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and wish to acknowledge Indigenous and First Nations participants who are joining us today from both Australia and overseas. I'm deeply honoured to be here in the company of three wonderful artists from Canberra, Nancy Tingey, John Pratt and Ian Bignell, three very committed and highly talented visual artists who've contributed so much to the provision of the very extraordinary Painting for Parkinson's program operating in the ACT. I'll just briefly speak about each of the artists, then hand it to them and they'll hand it on to each other. Firstly, Nancy will commence speaking with us about the history and background to the program, which she founded 27 years ago. She is a committed, passionate and most imaginative artist with massive life experience on both sides of the equator, ensuring that the ACT and the Parkinson's community are all the richer for her presence. Second speaker will be John Pratt, another of our living legends in the ACT, and many students and lovers of the visual arts speak so highly of him and all that he so generously and gently offers to the ACT community. He is highly respected as both an artist and an educator, and how lucky are we to have him in the ACT also. To complete the triple treat, we have Ian Bignell, and welcome to Ian, another committed artist and educator whose life has taken him on many journeys here and overseas as well. Ian has done much to ensure the Painting for Parkinson's program goes far beyond the ACT, and another gem in our ACT Arts treasure chest. A big welcome to you all, and over to you, Nancy. Thank you.
Twice.
That's great, Nancy. You can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Marika Rose. I'm afraid I'll have to start off by annoying Philip by saying it's called Painting with Parkinson's, not for it. This is because I purposely thought when I started out, you're painting with the condition rather than making it worse, I think, was what was at the back of my mind by, in somehow or other, making it seem as something that it was that we wanted to continue. Anyway, that goes way back, 27 years. As I said, my husband had been diagnosed with Parkinson's aged 46 in 1987. And after a few years, well, he was early onset, and very active, and he was asked to be president of Parkinson's ACT in 1993. And I was appalled because it probably meant that they expected me to be the secretary, and that was my worst nightmare. So in a way, Painting with Parkinson's started in a very negative way, and I apologize for that. It was my way of getting out of doing something else. And because my background is as an artist and a carer, I wanted to combine those in some way so that I didn't feel too frustrated about having to do the carer role and not being able to continue my art practice. So also, I thought when I started it, I thought it would be a way of people just learning, understanding that they could actually perhaps forget about Parkinson's for a little while And so it was a sort of sheltered workshop, particularly for one member of the group. And we'll put the first image on, please. Have you got it? Hello, is Erica Rose there?
Yes, yeah, I'm on my way. We're almost there. Apologies for my.
That's all right. Anyway, I can talk about Jack before the image comes on. I had 2 people to start with the group, although I was supposed to have 12 to get the grant, and I had to ignore that. And one of them was a man who'd been to the art school, but he had Parkinson's quite badly. He was a scientist as his main career, and so when I offered to run an art group, he saw that as a sheltered workshop, in which he would not have to explain to everybody why 1 minute he couldn't paint and why 1 minute he could. We would understand about the condition. We assumed that anybody coming into the group, they wouldn't have to explain to us what their situation was. Jack did this painting in a very early session with the group. We started with these 2 people. Jack was the one who had been most interested in the arts and done a lot of painting, and was also very, very musical. And Bob and I took along, my husband Bob and I took along to the meeting a recording of the Elgar cello concerto and put that on as background music. And this is what Jack painted to that. Immediately, he got into the idea that he didn't have to copy something or learn how to paint. He just had to respond to the music by making marks on the paper. And so that you see this long maroon colored line going right across the paper, that's the cello. And then later in the piece, you get these staccato plucking of strings and so on. And those are the little black marks at the end. So he was using the art to express his emotions. He was not using it to paint something realistic. And in fact, it's quite hard for people with Parkinson's to paint something realistic, because one of the things that goes is their appreciation of verticals and horizontals. And copying is actually really quite hard anyway. Where do you start? And as we know with Parkinson's, it's very important that you go step by step, rather than being confronted by a whole lot of things at once, a whole lot of imagery at once. You like to spread it out a bit and go one step at a time, as you would with walking. And then the other person that was in the group was a woman called Mary, who'd done no painting before, but her husband was worried about her depression. But she had a very, sorry, I don't think this is supposed to come on yet. Do you want me to talk to that? That's right, thanks. I was a bit stuck with it as to what she wanted to paint. I said, well, what do you like? What do you enjoy doing? She said, oh, I like gardening. I enjoy my garden. So I said, supposing we do something about the garden. And so we talked a bit about what shape flowers were and so on. And she rather painstakingly built up some images. And I went off to have and see what Jack was doing. And then I went back to see how Mary was going. And there was this very strange little image in the top right-hand corner. And I asked her what that was about. And she said, oh, well, that's Homer. He lives in the corner of our living room. And I knew then that she'd got it, because that meant she felt free to paint whatever she wanted in that painting. She didn't have to be told what to do anymore. And from there on, she was actually quite strong-willed, which is quite a characteristic of Parkinson's, I find anyway. So that was the first sort of breakthrough that it was important that I didn't suggest to them what they did. They were perfectly capable of coming up with their own ideas. And the third person that came in was a woman who had severe depression, and she'd come on the recommendation of her doctor. And I realized I was going to be in deep water, because I did not have art therapy training. I was trained as a curator, I was trained as a lecturer and so on, but I was not an art therapist. And so I was talking to a friend about this, and she said, well, why don't you apply for a Churchill Fellowship? Because then you can get the training that you need and use that on top of what you already know. And that was absolutely life-changing for me. Because on the Churchill Fellowship, I traveled through Europe and America and met, for a start, a man who was hugely influential on our work, a Dr. Larker in Holland, who had done some research on creativity in Parkinson's. Being a neurologist, he was and a painter himself, he was very interested in what was happening in the brain when people were doing their artwork. And he decided to do a project looking at artists who had then developed Parkinson's and seeing whether they became more or less creative. And he discovered they became more creative. And that was an eye-opener for me, because if creativity is not affected by your Parkinson's, then we've got a winner with the art group, because we're onto something which is really important. The difficulty was not so much that they were not creative, they were creative. The problem was often, how do you get started with your creativity? And how do we get rid of the stress that stops people painting? So one of the things that we did, that I did quite early on with it, I was working with a group actually called Conquest in the south of England, who were working with various people with various disabilities, but it included Parkinson's. And what they would do was to get people to do a sort of doodle first, where it didn't matter how they did it. They could do it with their eyes closed. They could do it to music. And if I could have the next image, please. Are you there? This shows you somebody doing a drawing to music as a preliminary exercise, possibly with their eyes closed and with using a felt pen. And as you can see, it's not directed in any particular way. It's used as a way of helping them to make contact with the paper. They're just doing a scribble and then getting used to the idea of what that feels like. Then after this drawing was done, we gave them watercolor paper and watercolors. And if you show me the next image, please. The fellow who did that first drawing came up with this. And this, I know it's very simple, but it's a repetition in which he is totally in control. This was really important. By doing that preliminary rough drawing, the stress goes, and then they're able to do really whatever they like, whichever way they want to move the brush. If you notice the first, he called them two ducks in the end, but the first shape is then repeated almost exactly on the right-hand side. And the marks are the same in the right place. He was astonished. He couldn't believe that he could do it, but we see this often. If you can just get rid of the stress and if you can just help them to make contact with the paper, they become totally immersed in the process, and then they can do more or less whatever they want. The other thing that was important for me to understand was that actually making a mark was tremendously empowering. The next slide, please. We've got the next image there. It's gone. Here we are. There we are. In my travels, I went to a place called the Struthers Center in America. And there was a woman who was in a wheelchair, didn't move at all day. She was brought to the center in the morning and then collected in the afternoon. And she just sat in the wheelchair the whole day. And she didn't smile or give any kind of response to what was happening. And so I was asked to see if I could work with her, perhaps get some kind of response. I just had a piece of paper which I put onto my photograph album that I was carrying with me. She couldn't reach forward onto the table because she was so disabled, but she could just, with my help, hold a felt pen. And I helped her to place the front felt pen on the paper, halfway across the bottom area. You can see it's where it starts. And then I just gently moved the book so that I was watching which way she wanted to go. She wanted to go right round the edge. And so I turned the book round until she had turned the first line all the way around and connected in the bottom. And then she indicated she wanted to do that again. And so she made 4 lines. You can see 4 orange lines going all the way around the outside. And then she indicated a change of color. So she picked out a blue-green color. And she did these up and down marks all the way around, which are actually quite controlled. The spacing is very even until she got to the other end. And then she sat back and she smiled. And the staff said that in 6 months, this woman had been coming to the centre. She had never smiled before. That was the first time she'd had any response whatever. And that made me understand how empowering making a mark on a piece of paper was. Later, I was to understand more fully when my husband lost the use of his writing arm and could no longer write his signature, and then is reduced to just writing a cross. And it made me think about the importance in our culture of things like signatures, being able to sign for a card, being able to sign your name anywhere. And supposing you lose that ability, who are you? Bob said to me one day, only a few years before he died, I'm a non-person. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I haven't got a credit card. So I wanted to laugh. I thought he was lucky, but I didn't. And I said, and I realized that what he was saying was he not only hadn't got a credit card, he hadn't got a passport anymore, which he always valued highly. He hadn't got a driving license. Who was he? He couldn't speak. And yet inside him, he was, somebody who'd had a really interesting, active life. And so painting was a signature, as long as we didn't interfere with what they painted, and we never suggested that they did something which was our idea, not their idea, that this was hugely important to them. Everybody painted in a different way. Everybody painted their marks in a different way. It was their work. It was very important that it was not our work. We never tried to teach them. We set it up in a way that they would be able to relax in. We had all the materials ready so that there'd be no interruptions once they got started. Because, of course, with Parkinson's, if you're interrupted, you have to start again. An important job, really, was to get rid of the stress or the need to control everything, and to find ways that they could be helped to make those first marks and then develop those marks in their own way until they'd finished. And actually, one of the interesting things about people with Parkinson's is that they tend to be obsessive. And I've been criticized for saying that about people, but it's actually a strength. It means that once they start to work, they tend to carry on until they've finished and become totally absorbed by what they're doing. And the work can be very intense and it's often very emotional. Now, can we have a look at the next slide, please? Thank you. In my travels, I worked for a little while with a group in Italy, a woman called Attilia Cosio, who was a fully trained art therapist, and her husband had Parkinson's, so we had a lot to talk about. And one of the exercises that she did with her pupils, as she said, call them, was something that Bob took part in, which was just using blue paint, because blue is calming for people with Parkinson's, well, anybody, it calms the nervous system down, in a rhythmic oval movement, lightening towards the center. That was very important because she felt that gave people a sense of hope, whereas if they had the dark in the center, that was to do much more with depression. So it was dark towards the edges and lighter towards the center. And Bob found this immensely calming. He loved doing it. He did many of these over the years. And it's one of the first exercises that I did with the group when I came back to Canberra. It was combined with something else that I'd picked up watching an exercise class at the Struthers Institute. There was a group sitting in the car park doing exercises. And one of them was doing oval movements with their arms. And I thought, well, and having been to Attilia's class and also been to meditation classes for people with Parkinson's and yoga and so on, I was beginning to understand that we needed to use these techniques to calm down the nervous system before we started, and then combine it with some kind of movement. And if possible, which is what we try and do in our class, continue that movement onto the paper without interruption. So we try and, well, perhaps John and Ian will explain this better, but we try and set it up in such a way that there is no interruption between that exercise bit and then actually continuing that movement on the paper. Now, if I move over to the next slide, please, we can take this a little bit further. I was working with Parkinson's UK for a while, doing a pilot trial, showing them, you know, whether painting with Parkinson's worked or not. I did feel as if I was trying to reinvent the wheel a bit, but never mind. At this class, which was in Shrewsbury in the Midlands in England, I started the session by getting them to wave their arms up and down from the left to the right and so on, and backwards and forwards. And then when they were ready, do the same movement, holding a felt pen on a piece of paper that was already set up in front of them without a break. And my husband did that without any problems, you know, he was enjoying the movement. And then after a while, I could see some people were getting a bit bored. So I said, well, you know, now we'll give you some more paper and paints and do whatever you like. But Bob didn't. He stayed with that piece of paper. It's quite a large piece of paper. And he then introduced working with some inks and then some watercolors. And then I think there's some finger paint in that as well, building up this movement of waves in the sea. And what he was doing was remembering being on an Antarctic boat. He was a geologist who worked mostly in Antarctica, going to Antarctica on the Southern Oceans and being seasick most of the time. It was quite a challenging journey. And he was rediscovering that sensation. And in fact, there's very little horizon in this painting, which suggests to me, you know, it's quite a terrifying sort of image. On top of that, he also later told me that he'd been watching the film about Ernest Shackleton the night before. And as he was doing the painting, that memory of that story came back to him. So it indicated to me the power of them using painting to recall some part of their lives or something important to them or something which was deeply affecting for them and some deep emotion or so on. So the importance of them doing their own sort of work was incredible, really. I suppose what that really, I think the fact that we're working on it in this way is trying to help them recall imagery, to experience emotions, is probably what makes it a bit different from normal art classes, because we don't expect them to paint like anybody else. And in fact, we would discourage that. Although sometimes, of course, people get an idea from another artist, that's fine, but it's up to them what they do. And we're really trying to help them rediscover their sense of identity. We set it up, we de-stress, and then we see what happens. I'd now like to hand over to John to explain how we do that in a class, please. John's been leading the group for many years. Hello, John.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for that. That was a great overview. Yeah, as Nancy says, I intended to give you a sort of an insight into the way each session works. But I'd like to say at the beginning that there's possibly not a definitive approach. We have 6 facilitators working at the moment, each of whom brings a particular presence, a particular energy, a sensibility to the group. And the group is, how shall I put it, very tolerant of the idiosyncrasies that each of those people brings along. However, we do have a structure that we try to keep to, because I think that kind of consistency helps everyone in the group adjust to the ideas that we bring along. There are between 12 and 14 members in the group. And we have, we've been meeting in a room, a studio space at the Australian National Botanic Gardens, the Banksia Centre. Now that centre is idyllic in a way, and I think we've been very fortunate over the years to have access to that area. We're surrounded by Banksia woodland, and I think kind of birdsong is probably the abiding soundscape around us. There are between, yeah, as I say, 12 and 14 members that come along, or participants that come along each week. We meet on a weekly basis, Friday, between about 10 and 12 o'clock. People when they start arriving at about 9:30, they have coffee, tea, refreshments, and I think that kind of social zone before we start painting is critically important. It enables each of the participants to exchange, to converse about ideas that perhaps they haven't had the opportunity through the rest of the week. It also is a way of setting up a kind of a bonding within the group as well. As I say, that initial session, we're setting up the materials for the day, and at the same time, the participants are enjoying some refreshment and conversation. When we start, we undertake a series of physical exercises, very, how can I put it, gentle, stretching exercises, legs, arms, fingers, hands, just as a way of, I suppose, becoming alert and sensorily aware. I think drawing, painting, while the hand is the articulator, the body needs to be in an alert state in order for that to happen. Those physical exercises may last between 5 and 10 minutes, and they segue into a series of quiet breathing exercises where we're really intent on making sure everyone is breathing, using their diaphragm and getting maximum input, if you like. So that sense of alertness, of physicality, is very much part of the session. That those breathing exercises lead to a short meditation before we start. And then that leads into the idea that we're going to be working with. Now, the idea, the theme, is often, as Nancy says, it can be a piece of music, it can be a poem, it can even be an object at times. But whenever we introduce an object, it's not as a starting point for an observational exercise. It may have a kind of a sequence, a sense of touch associated with it, or a sequence of linear directions, or a texture, that can enable a set of marks. So it's a catalyst, a visual catalyst, if you like. I think also it can even extend to, there have been times where, as a starting point, I've just crumpled a piece of paper and put that down in front of each person and undertaken a blind drawing where we're not looking at the drawing itself, but we're going on a journey. And I encourage everyone to just look at the edge or a crease or fold in the paper and to follow that edge or fold, just to visually track how the directional flow that edge or fold takes up. And so that it comes back to, I think, an artist we often refer to called Paul Klee, who pioneered this idea of taking a line for a walk. And I think a lot of the processes we use, it's the passage, it's the process, which is the important thing, not the kind of the destination. So that initial starting point is a suggestive, it's a speculative moment. I'm just thinking that, for instance, a lot of the sessions, we have a live musician coming along. We have a collaborative arrangement with the Canberra Symphony Orchestra, who deliver a musician once a month, and having that live presence of music in the room becomes an incredibly potent and evocative moment. And the kind of, I think the power of it often relates back to the idea there's no, again, definitive response to a piece of music. It is idiosyncratic, it's subjective, it's to do with how we respond emotively and psychologically to that particular sound. So the materials we use, as Nancy has alluded to, watercolor, ink onto a wet surface. I think that material process of where those materials diffuse and set up certain trajectories on the paper are incredibly powerful for each of the participants. It's a collaborative process between them and the materials, the process of those, how those materials react as they apply the watercolor or the ink to the paper. Yeah, it's, I think all of the processes that we use tend to be they encourage a sense of playfulness, I should say, rather than intent. The intent happens through the process of involvement with the materials onto the paper. There are some, over a session, there may be people who complete 5 or 6 paintings. There may be those who complete 1 painting. It's, again, very interesting the way that involvement, that immersion in the process has, again, particular definements for each individual. As a facilitator during that process, I'm intent on making sure that the materials are at everyone's disposal. But there are facilitators who actually work with also paint and draw with the group. So it depends very much on who's involved with the group that day. At the end of the session, there is we probably draw paint for close on an hour and a half. And at the end of that session, there's a discussion, an overview of how everyone's experienced the painting. And that is an interesting period where people talk about the various emotions, the psychological states that have been evoked through that participation. It's also, I think, a moment when people affirm and share particular ideas that they have in common, as well as acknowledging the individuality of each person's response to the idea or the theme that we've been working with. Yeah, it's, let me look at my notes here. I think I'll leave it at that and pass over to you, Ian. And as I say, I'm really open to questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John and Nancy. It's a pleasure for me to listen to you both. I learn so much each time. As John has outlined, we've been running the sessions face-to-face, and Nancy's been doing it for close on 27 years. But of course, with COVID, things have had to change a little bit. And so that sort of pushed our thinking a little bit. And it's opened up the opportunities to do it sort of no longer face-to-face, but to do it in much longer distances. So we have modified sessions really, and it's taken us a couple of weeks, a couple of months really, to sort of get the model together. And the thing that I've realized most importantly is that we're doing art therapy sessions online, but we're also building a real sense of community. And COVID has done a number of things for us, but it's made me realize, and I think a number of our painters, how important that rapport with each other is, and how we're doing that through our painting and sharing our thoughts and feelings. So to set up was a bit of work. So on my part, I've facilitated the COVID Zoom sessions with one and sometimes two other facilitators. So we split the group up. I had about 8, and that involved actually ringing them on an individual basis and sorting out the technology and sorting out the art materials. Particularly during this last series of lockdowns, we couldn't actually give people art materials. So it was a matter of talking through with people what they needed, sourcing that, and even helping people buy the art materials online. In some cases, it involved briefing the carers too, and how best to assist people sort of to paint with us online. Then, as John and Nancy have alluded to, music is actually a really important part of the whole process. I find with my own painting, and I find with these sessions too, that it takes you out of yourself. You can just let go and you can just be painting. Well, music across Zoom is a little more difficult, and we've experimented with a few models. Sometimes I've put music on and shared screen, but it really depends on what sort of setup people have. And sometimes it was better if they just muted and didn't hear it at all. Other people have done their own music. Several times I've sent out ideas for what to download, and people play it at their own pace. But usually what we find is that it's probably better if people are painting and they actually mute. With the stimulus, we do the same sort of thing. I found that poetry works really well. Fairly short pieces of poetry that have a lot of images in it or lots of feelings in them. Sometimes word pictures work. We're fortunate in Canberra now, we're having this magnificent spring, and several times now I've talked about my own garden and my joy in being in the garden, and that has stimulated the paintings. We then, I should mention, we start off with a series of exercises before we do the stimulus. So again, we stretch our hands and our fingers and our shoulders and just get that movement, just move away from our everyday life. For some of our painters, they've been sitting down for hours on end and they haven't moved for quite a while. So gentle movement, gentle meditation. I lead 3 people through a very quiet 2 or 3 meditation, and then we move on to the stimulus. And then, best of all, we then paint. As I said, sometimes with music, sometimes it's better if we just mute. The last couple of sessions, what's really worked well is everybody has kept their mic on, and we've just listened to each other, brushes on paper and splashes of water. And I find that very soothing. That's worked quite well. We've been, at first I thought, I don't know how long people are going to want to paint over Zoom, but as it turns out, it's went from 45 minutes to an hour and a quarter. And now I really sort of have to try and stop at about an hour, 15 minutes or so, because I can see people getting tired. We then have the opportunity to share those paintings, and this has got sort of bigger and bigger. Some people choose not to share their paintings, and of course that's fine. But more and more, I find over Zoom, people really want to share their paintings and they want to talk about their paintings. And as both John and Nancy have said, people are talking about not only the physical things on the paper, but their thoughts and feelings and memories that are brought back. Last week, we did a session on the beach, because we're all hoping we can get to the beach this summer. And the memories that people brought back of happy times with children or grandchildren or loved ones at the beach, just through a very simple poem I had given of waves crashing on a beach. I think it really moved the whole group. I find after that session that people are, we're tired, we've actually given a lot, we've shared a lot, and people are ready just to close off and then move off to their lunch. There's a bit of a follow-up. Some people work with each other via email and Facebook page. Some do it, some don't. So it's their choice. So that's sort of the way we've been handling it during the lockdowns. And as I said before, it's opening up a whole new field for us, how we can do things a little bit differently and extend our ideas and thinking. I also just wanted to take a moment or two to show this manual. I wonder if I hold it up, can that be seen? So this is a manual that I wrote with Nancy and John and facilitators and painters and carers. It's the purpose of it is just to give an outline of the program to everyone that's involved, and particularly for the painters, so that they know what to expect. I find that the family members and carers are really keen to have this, because it gives them an idea of what we're doing. As Nancy said, we're not teaching art techniques, although underneath that does come through a bit. We're actually doing art therapy, and we want people to be quite clear about that. So this manual just steps through the role of each of the people involved in the program. I've been particularly keen to have the role of music and the importance of flow that Nancy talked about. For me, that works really well, from the gentle movement through the meditation, and then I always try to match the music to it. If we're doing something gentle, we have some gentle music, and you can see people sort of moving. It's almost as if their hands just keep moving with their brushes on the paper, and that's, of course, the beauty of watercolour, because it just flows and it just runs and it does beautiful things. All right. Oh, the other thing about the manual is that we've included lots of examples of people's work, including, as for Nancy, there's one of Bob's. It's called Sunburst. Okay. Well, that's a bit of an outline of what we do via Zoom. I imagine I now hand back to Philip for questions.
Good. Great, thank you so much there. What a wonderful presentation, everybody. And perhaps just if anyone's got some questions, to put those into the chat now and we'll come to them. But yes, firstly, what a beautiful coverage of this extraordinary program from our three speakers. And yes, apologies, Nancy, I got my wording wrong there. But thank you for sharing such a personal journey there. And yes, what a privilege it has been to have known you through so much of that of late. And particularly found the journey all the more fascinating, the way you were referencing each of the images and telling the stories that went with them. Fabulous, fabulous. John, thank you for so eloquently sharing those practical details of each class. And I've had the privilege of being at some of them, and they do a very fine morning tea there too, I must confess. A great incentive to come along. And Ian, thank you for clarifying some of those challenges and issues, I guess, of the COVID experience and the silver linings that you obviously have embraced and made the virtual classroom work so well. So yeah, a beautiful presentation from the three of you. Thank you. And perhaps just while we're waiting to see if any chats do come through, one question I might just ask is, how have you seen the program evolve, change, develop over its 27 years? What is different about the program now and about the program back in the early days?
But I think in some ways, Philip, the program, the members of the group shift the dynamics, the chemistry of how everyone kind of connects, and the kind of the processes we use and the opportunities that arise. For instance, at the moment, one of the participants has set up a Instagram account, and so suddenly the group has an online presence, and that has opened up a series of opportunities. I think exhibiting work has also changed. Belconnen Arts Centre have been really generous in terms of providing us with opportunities to put work up in public spaces, whether that's in public service buildings or in libraries. And I think that has enabled a broader awareness about what the program is about, but also it's shifted each participant. I think there's a sense of affirmation of
of who they are, really.
Exactly. There's a sense of agency that's being acknowledged. I think that's really powerful. I think that process of having the work out there enables a rich and very therapeutic kind of role. Yeah.
I think when I started out, I just saw it as something fun for them to do, to take their mind off Parkinson's. And it wasn't until the Churchill Fellowship they realised there was more to it than that. I think you have a much richer programme than the one that we started out with. That's what's exciting. I think that's the only way you can sustain a programme, can make it keep changing a bit. But certainly the exhibition thing was important to me, because what I wanted to do was to help to raise awareness about Parkinson's in the general community. And that's what the exhibition is able to do. People are astonished by the way that the paintings move them. They may not be, terribly clever, but they are moving.
Terrific. And Ian, was there anything you wanted to add at all to that question?
No, I think it's been well covered. Thank you.
Sure. And just a couple of questions from one of our local Canberra residents, actually. So impressed about the program and wondering, is it possible for her to come and visit the program, and also is it possible to purchase the book? Can we put some details about the program onto our resource library so people could could check that out and get back to you with more details of possibly visiting?
Well, it's actually on our own website, so Painting with Parkinson's, and there's details of the manual. And I think Eric has just added it.
Yep, she has to. Thank you,
Just-
Eric.
she's
So
very
onto
nice.
it.
Yeah, so we can have it in hard copy as well as e-format. Nancy hasn't mentioned it, but this is the companion piece to the book that she wrote, which is called Magic Happens. So we have Magic Happens, which is the history, and it's beautifully illustrated with lots of paintings, and then How Magic Happens, which is the follow-up manual.
Yeah.
So there we are. There's a plug for you, Nancy.
Thank you for that. I did forget. And I was just going to say that make sure when you look things up on the website that you have .org.au, because there's an American one, .com, which is totally different.
Those two resources sound like a perfect marriage to enable programs to take off. Are there many other programs around Australia of this nature, to your knowledge?
There's been a group of Painting with Parkinson's programs started by Anne Atkin, who has Parkinson's, and she's been fantastic. She's in Victoria, but unfortunately she's really ill now, and she's only able to keep going with one. But Parkinson's Victoria, I think, is still running quite a few of those programs with her, but it's a little bit different from ours in that they do a lot more of the art therapy side. They have art therapists running it, whereas ours goes across the board. We're not, yes, it's group art therapy, but I think we try and focus very much, in my case anyway, on Parkinson's. You know, what are the characteristics of Parkinson's, which mean that general art therapy doesn't necessarily work.
It's interesting that use of the word therapy, isn't it? Because therapy could apply to any creative practice in a way, in sense of the kind of the emotional states that it elicits. I just think it's a slightly derided term, but I think it's used in a very it can be used in a very general way about any kind of creative activity.
I have noticed, well, say with the person that came in, the third person that came into the group, which set off the Churchill Fellowship, actually, she really probably would have benefited from one-to-one art therapy, but I couldn't persuade her to go down that route. And of course, I was not a fully trained art therapist, so I couldn't do it myself. I mean, I was interested in the group model where you've got people influencing one another, and as John said, you know, really well about the community aspect of it. It's more than just a painting, I think.
Thank you. Just got sort of 1 minute for a final question before we need to wrap up. But Linda has asked about the importance of relaxation before actually making art, and is this something that you, as artists yourselves, feel is necessary before you create on your own?
Well, that's a good question. I think yes. I mean, there's plenty written about artists using various winding down processes. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that most artists will use some kind of winding down thing, even if it's just starting by tidying up the studio or whatever, or putting some music on, or just sitting there for a while. But the interesting thing is that I find people with Parkinson's can't paint, can't get started unless they have that. They have to have something that helps them to wind down. They can't just sit down and paint.
Philip, I noticed there was a second question, I think, from Karen about is it possible for her to see a session? We're actually starting face-to-face sessions again tomorrow. We're very excited about that at the Botanic Gardens. So perhaps not for the first couple of weeks, because we have to be very careful about numbers and COVID restrictions. But if Karen would like to contact us via the website, the Australian one, not the American one, we'd be able to talk to her and perhaps arrange a time.
Fantastic, great, thank you very much for that. Well, I'm getting the wind-up signals. So just a massive, massive thanks to the three of you, and how privileged we are in Canberra to have the three of you here delivering an extraordinary program that has such a rich and invaluable offerings for our Parkinson's community. And thank you so much for sharing that journey and the insights and the growth that continues to happen, COVID withstanding, have been a very insightful, fascinating and interesting journey. Thank you so very, very much. And I think Erica Rose wants to pop in now with just a final word. Thank you, Erica.
Just to echo Philip's thoughts, a really, really big thank you to you, and such a privilege to have you share your work with us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just a direction to everyone that we're going to take a brief pause. This will be the end of the live stream session, but want to invite you to jump on in and participate in our next session, which is a Zoom link, which we'll post in the chat, but with the wonderful Dr. Katrina Rank, who will be running a participatory workshop on her recent creation film called Firebird, and then a screening of the film and question and answers. Thank you, everybody, and have a really wonderful day.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank
It's been great. Thank you.